Cardinal George Pell has been sentenced to 6 years in prison for the sexual abuse of 2 choir boys in the 1990s.
Here's a summary of the article.
County Court Chief Judge Peter Kidd has sentenced Cardinal George Pell to 6 years jail for sexually abusing 2 choir boys when he was Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne in the 1990s. Pell has spent the past 2 weeks in custody waiting to be sentenced for 1 count of sexual penetration of a child under 16 and 4 counts of committing an indecent act with a child. Nor are you being sentenced for any failure to prevent or report child sexual abuse by other clergy within the Catholic Church. Pell, 77, was found guilty by a jury last December of sexually abusing the choir boys after a Sunday Mass in December 1996 and then assaulting one of them a second time 2 months later. The first attack occurred just 2 months after Pell had announced the Melbourne Response, a scheme to deal with sexual abuse claims against clergy. The court heard that Pell abused the choir boys, who cannot be identified, after celebrating one of his first Sunday Masses as Archbishop at St. Patrick's Cathedral in East Melbourne. One of the former choir boys gave evidence Pell had planted himself in the doorway and said something like, "What are you doing here?" or, "You're in trouble."
This post received a score of 32,815, with an upvote ratio of 95%. Here are the top comments in response to this article.
Meanwhile, the Catholic Church wants Pete Davidson to apologize for insinuating they've got the same problems as R. Kelly. Well, I'm sorry you fuck kids in the ass. Pete. He's not wrong.
Technically that is an apology.
Francis D. Pope has something to say about that.
Greater than the Pope says this in connection to what he said above, that in the moments of suffering and feeling of helplessness there is the divine whom we can hold on to and seek soccer. Kicking the ball around with Jesus always lifts my spirits a bit.
Greater than soccer. I think it meant sucker.
I hardly know.
Any old iron, any old iron, any old iron.
Is that all?
Yep. He's in his late 70s, so hopefully he never has the opportunity to be free again.
His appeal will be held in June, so he might only end up in custody for 3 to 6 months. I'm doubtful that appeal will go through. The defense barely had an argument to begin with. Don't see how an appeal changes anything.
If either of these did, a retrial would be ordered. The third, that the jury couldn't conceivably reach the verdict rationally, has the strongest chance. No one has heard the victim's testimony, and we only have the quotes used by the prosecution in later questioning and summation.
There isn't really any precedent for the appeal judges to use that either to overturn the decision. Any successful appeal on those grounds would be perceived as character ground bias. I listened to the judge's sentencing summary. It would be extraordinary if the appeals judges overturned this one. That said, I'm not a lawyer.
In the judge's sentencing remarks he said that he considered Pell's advanced age in the sentencing and wanted to give him a sentence that would allow him to live the final years of his life in the community. WTF.
Apparently this was said so that his lack of consideration of this wouldn't be grounds for an appeal of the sentence.
Precisely. The sentence is lenient so that there is very little chance of appeal and very little chance of parole. To get parole he would have to admit guilt.
Greater than to get parole he would have to admit guilt. That is not correct. Disgraceful, he should rot in jail for the rest of his life.
He may well be.
Why leave it to chancel? On top of it, the entire Catholic Church ought to be dismantled in Australia.
Because the appeal relies on the sentence being too harsh for the evidence submitted to the court.
A recap of what happened today. Chief Judge Peter Kidd has sentenced George Pell to 6 years in prison, including a non-parole period of 3 years, 8 months for the sexual abuse of 2 boys at Melbourne's St. Patrick's Cathedral in the 1990s. His likelihood of reoffending. Judge Kidd acknowledged that Pell has not been convicted of child sex abuse-related crimes in the next 22 years after his Melbourne offence, however he acknowledged for a second time that Pell had shown no remorse and that there remained no explanation for it. He also acknowledged the resumption of Pell's earlier life in the aftermath of this case was now impossible. His otherwise blameless life. Judge Kidd acknowledged that Pell had no prior convictions nor conducting similar criminal actions after the Melbourne offence, as well as positive character reference letters from the likes of ex-Prime Minister John Howard.
This video was automatically created by Reddit to speech. The article and comments in this video were selected from Reddit according to their upvotes, and any paraphrasing was performed by smmry.com, without any human intervention.